There are two things that huge numbers of people get wrong about swords. One of these is that blades must be springy. In fact, not at all. And the other one is that blades have to be really stiff. And again, that's also incorrect. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this comes from a discussion which actually happened online really recently, this week actually, and it's really fascinating because coming from a fencing or HEMA or even reenactment background, a lot of people assume that swords in history must all be flexible because the swords that we use are flexible. They're made of essentially spring steel, carbon steel, hardened and then tempered so that it is springy. And in fact, this is true of many practice weapons, obviously modern Olympic fencing weapons, but even our HEMA weapons and reenactment weapons. And indeed, within a certain parameters of history and geography, some swords were springy. Now, it is true to say that most swords from medieval, Renaissance and later Europe are indeed flexible. And not only from Europe and only from that period, but there are also African swords like this takuba, which have flexible blades. There are various Asian swords, including Chinese swords, which have flexible blades, and some Indian swords, which have very flexible blades. Perhaps most famously, you might think of the Arumi, for example. But yes, absolutely, there are flexible blades in India. And so given that there are plenty of flexible swords in history and across the world, I understand that when people's primary exposure is to modern fencing weapons, HEMA weapon or Olympic style weapons, then they should assume that all swords should have flexible blades. And it makes sense, right? You would think, well, there's lots of advantages to having a flexible blade because it can act as a shock absorber and not get bent but still be quite hard. And it makes logical sense. But here's the thing. There are absolutely loads of swords from history which aren't flexible. That's right, there are tons and tons of swords from across the world, across the centuries, that when you do this to them, they do not spring back into a straight line, they stay bent. And really, this should come as no surprise to anyone who thinks about the Bronze Age. Anyone who knows about the material of bronze will know that, yes, indeed, it has a tiny bit of flex. If I just apply a little bit of pressure to it here, it will come back to straight. And so technically, that's true of most materials. Most materials do have a tiny bit of flex. But if I was to try and flex this anything like the amount that I would flex this steel blade here, and it comes back to true, and I'm not going to do it to my lovely bronze sword here, but if I was to do that, for example, over my knee, which I could do, or over my head or whatever, then it would bend and it would stay bent. That's what bronze does. But for some reason, when it comes to steel swords, I think that a lot of people, particularly with a Western-centric view, particularly looking at medieval and Renaissance or later period swords, they forget that there are lots of swords from history made of steel, not even bronze, which aren't flexible like this. The most famous example that most people are exposed to are Japanese swords, like tachi and katana and wakizashi, for example. But they aren't the only ones. And we're going to explain here why. Why is it that some people have flexible blades and some people had non-flexible blades? But first of all, what happens if I take a Japanese blade, for example, I grab it, I'm not going to do it here, but if I grab it and bend it over my knee, the answer is it stays bent. This is true of all traditionally made Japanese swords. Whether it's old Koto Tachi or whether it's Shinshinto Katana or Naginata or Yari, all of these Japanese blades, if you bend them, they stay bent. And a lot of people list this as a sort of a flaw or a weakness of Japanese blades. But this isn't unique to Japanese blades. It's actually incredibly common, as we saw in the Bronze Age, but this is incredibly common with certain blade types in Europe, Africa, Asia, just all over the world. It's not just Japanese swords that are like this. For example, many of you on this channel and just generally who know about swords will know about woots, the wonderful steel, what gives us the origin of Damascus or damask steel. So Wootz steel is a type of crucible steel, which in its time was very advanced because it had been essentially liquefied and then turned into a more or less homogeneous piece of steel. at a time when most other steel wasn't made like that, and so other steel tend to have more inclusions and slag and things like this, whereas Wootz steel is, you could say, purer from a certain sense. So everybody kind of recognises that the much sought after Wootz steel, like this original antique Shamshir I'm holding here, very sought after, very hard, very good, homogeneous, good quality steel for its time, and we'll come back to that in a bit. Much to some people's surprise, Wootz is not generally, in fact, very rarely, hardly ever, spring-tempered. It's edge-quenched, exactly like a Japanese sword. Now, most people think of edge-quenching as something peculiar to the Japanese, but it's absolutely not. Edge quenching was done in Europe, Africa, all over Asia in different places. Edge quenching is one solution to create a harder edge on your blade. But if you only edge quench something, then you can't create a spring from that blade in the way that you do when you through quench, when you entirely quench a blade, for example, on this rapier. Other weapons which include edge quenching, for example, are kukris. These are usually edge quenched with water along the edge, but they're not usually quenched on the entire blade. In fact, edge quenching was completely normal all across Asia, and we find it on all sorts of Southeast Asian weapons, which very often have a soft back and an edge-quenched, hardened, differentially hardened edge at the front only. And we also find the same thing, for example, in the Philippines, where things like this kris are usually edge-hardened, but not hardened all the way through. And as we've said with Wootz blades, this is usually the case, and indeed it's usually the case with traditional Indian tulwar. So in fact, in India, for example, we can find both types. We can find spring-tempered blades, which are through-quenched and then tempered, and then we can find probably the older type, which are only edge-hardened and they're left soft along the back, exactly like Japanese swords. So the question is, why did some people spring temper swords and others only edge hardened them? Well, the fact is, we've got to put this into the context of the time in which they were doing this, working with the materials available to them. Now, in the modern world, we have access to really brilliant modern alloy spring steels, things like 5160, 6150, EN45, 01, whatever you want to use, okay? 1095, you could go on and on and on with the list. But you can take a modern, homogeneous, factory-produced steel. You know exactly what it is. You know exactly how to heat it and what temperature to quench it at. You know exactly the temperature and for how long to temper it at to create a really effective spring. Okay, now you can do these things by eye, and plenty of people, even in the modern world, do, and obviously traditionally they did without modern ovens and thermometers and everything else. So absolutely you can create a spring-tempered blade in period, and they did, and this was normal in the late medieval period all the way through the Renaissance and industrial period, right the way through the 19th century and so on. Most of these swords behind me here are spring-tempered. However, many of the traditional Asian swords and some African swords aren't spring-tempered. Why would they do that? So, if you have a Wootz blade, for example, if you try to spring temper this, it will become very brittle and far more likely to break. So, and this can be true of Japanese steel as well, not necessarily, but it depends. So one choice to make is, would you rather have a harder edge and a back which bends, or would you rather have essentially a slightly softer edge with a traditional steel that you're spring tempering, that you might not want to quench as hard as you could, kind of brutally as you could quench an edge on one of these edge hardened blades or a Japanese blade. So a slightly softer edge, but a springy body. You think about this from a fighting perspective. So this blade here, which is edge quenched, that or a Japanese sword could be as hard as 60 Rockwell at the edge, but really soft, like 15 or 20 at the back, and therefore if we suffer some kind of catastrophic failure, the worst that will happen to this blade is it will get bent. If the blade's bent, I straighten it, okay? Whereas this blade here is a bit softer at the edge, doesn't have such a hard edge as the edge quenched Japanese or Indian sword might do, so slightly softer at the edge because we want to maintain the toughness. We're not going to quench this as hard and as brutally. For example, Japanese swords are quenched with water, European swords usually quenched with oil. So a softer edge, but a springy body. So that's great. It can sustain lots of impacts and flex a lot, and it won't get bent. However, it might snap. So your basic choices: do you go with traditional materials? Do you go with a harder edge and a blade that might bend, or a blade which won't bend but might snap and has a slightly softer edge? And so you've got to make compromises, you've got to make a choice. And it doesn't mean that a blade that can bend over your knee if you force it to is inherently worse or inherently better than the springy blade. They've just got different strengths and weaknesses. So you have to decide which compromises you're willing to live with. And I would reiterate that in the modern world, for training purposes, we've gone for springy blades rather than blades that bend all the time. And that is part and parcel of a product of the fact that, number one, we've got modern, reliable steels and heat treatment, which they didn't have then. But secondly, the fact that most swords that we're using in day-to-day use are used for training purposes. And if one day they snap, you buy a new one. If a blade snaps in combat, that might mean you die. So in many cases, it might be preferable to choose a blade which is more likely to bend rather than snap, even if it means it doesn't have such a hard edge means you have to straighten it occasionally. So now we come on to the point of stiffness. Now, this is more a thing of people who aren't familiar with swords. People who are familiar with swords pretty much know that they're going to be springy, or at least training swords are usually going to be springy. However, they're not always. And for example, this sword, this tulwar here, is incredibly stiff. And it's part and parcel of how they're made. So this is an edge-quenched blade with a soft back, made in a very similar way to a Japanese katana, really, when we look at this from a kind of big picture point of view. This blade, however, is much thinner, but it is, of course, springy. Now, that does mean, because we can make the blade thinner, we can potentially make it longer. So when we're dealing with something like these rapiers behind me, these are original antiques, but they all have springy blades. I've shown this on camera before. I won't do it again because it's unnecessary stress to the blades, but they are springy. You can take my word for that. If you're going to make a blade which is long and narrow, it pretty much needs to be springy. And that's one reason why things like rapiers and small swords don't really appear very much outside of Europe, because Europe had this tradition of making springy blades. Now, not to say we don't find long springy blades in other places, we do, of course. There are long springy bladed Indian swords like the Arumi or the Firangi, and in Africa there's things like the Kaskara and the Tuguba, which can be quite long as well. But fundamentally, the existence of rapiers with long, narrow blades goes hand in hand with having reliable, springy steel. You couldn't make these with hard edges and a soft body because they would just bend all the time because of their shape, essentially. Okay, so this can be long and thin. However, if we have a blade which is built like a katana or certain types of tulwar, or even the Filipino weapons, they are inherently heavier for their length than those other blades because they have soft backs. Now, when you have a soft back, in order for the blade to not bend all the time, you have to make it thick. Okay, so tulwars of this type are very thick at the back, much thicker than most European swords are at the middle up here. These tend to have more distal taper, so they really get very, very thin towards the tip. Whereas the tulwar or the katana or the tachi or most Filipino swords, barong, kris, whatever, tend to stay thicker along the back. This is also true, incidentally, of a lot of Middle Eastern swords like the kilich and the shamshir. They stay thicker along the back of the edge because you need the thickness to give rigidity, because the back is soft. Because the back is soft and the edge is hard, you need thickness, cross-sectional thickness, which gives stiffness. So, are blades always stiff or flexy? It really entirely depends on, number one, what type of material they're made of. Bronze, for example, is quite heavy. It has to be made quite thick for its length in order for it to be rigid enough and not bend all the time. You can't make it anywhere near as thin as a steel blade. But even steel blades that are only edge quenched have to still be pretty thick at the back. And there is the other, as well as the general shape, thickness and breadth of the blade, there is the question of curved versus straight. And generally speaking, curved blades don't flex quite as easily as straight blades do for various reasons. And it is interesting to me that many cultures that have blades where they prefer to edge harden and have a thick back use curved blades. And I think these things go hand in hand, because if you're going to have a blade made of essentially soft steel at the back, hard brittle steel at the front, and therefore you're going to have a thick spine in order to make it rigid. By making it curved, that also makes the blade stronger, it helps support it, reduce the risk of bending, and all of these things. So they kind of go hand in hand. Whereas, generally speaking, the blades which are made of flexible steel can afford to be longer, straighter, thinner, all of these things. Okay, so these two different types of material are both perfectly historical, widely used. And if we go back to, for example, the Anglo-Saxon period, the migration era, we look at the sax, okay, the traditional Germanic knife, that has a blade which is more similar to this Indian tulwar than this Highland basket hilt, okay, because the sax is usually only edge quenched, much like a kukri, for example. So don't think that only certain Asian people did this edge quenching and soft back. We also find it in Europe with other types of sword, but then you look at the statistics of an Anglo-Saxon or Norse sax, and it shares a lot of similarities with certain Asian blades. It's got a thick back, soft back, hardened edge at the front, and it's fairly heavy for its length. So hopefully that dispels a few myths. The fact is that swords don't have to be flexible. They can be that you would bend them if you applied enough force to them, and they don't spring back, okay? But those are the blades which are generally made with a thicker spine and an edge which is edge quenched only, and it's not turned into a spring like some African and European and some Asian swords are. Okay, they are two different philosophies to solving a mechanical problem, but one is not inherently better than the other. They've just got different strengths and weaknesses. These can afford to have much harder edges on them, generally speaking, because you can harden the edge up to a higher degree than you can with the spring blades, at least with traditional steels. But the spring steel swords can afford to be longer, or rather lighter for the length or longer for the same weight, and so therefore they have their own advantages as well. So there we go. Which do you prefer? Do you have a preference between the edge hardened thicker blades like katana or talwar, or do you prefer the springier blades that are so beloved of modern sports practice and even test cutting to a large degree, if we ignore the Japanese side of things? But anyway, there we go. I hope that's helped clear up a few things. As always, when you're dealing with materials and history and limitations of what's available to you, it's all about compromises and context, of course. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, continue to be. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Please make sure you're subscribed and take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.